Conditions may apply by CinnamonPinecones. Read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 186. Ember's Last Spark. Toshinori had suffered this reality in his nightmares for years, all for one standing before him and laughing that god-awful laugh. The only thing that had kept him up more than knowing he had killed a man was the fear that he hadn't. And now that fear was standing right in front of him and laughing. He hadn't slept since he heard what had happened to the students. A normal man would be running on fumes, but his weak, frail, useless body was falling apart at the seams before he even made it to the battlefield. He wasn't enough to save these kids, and he knew it. He was going to die here, and he was terrified that it wouldn't be enough. All the fear he had felt in his entire life was compounded together when All for One sent him flying backward through several blocks worth of buildings. His students were there next to him. Midoriya was there next to that man, and Toshinori was too weak to save him. He was beyond scraping the bottom of the barrel. He was tearing it apart and using the staves to fuel his dying fire. With everything he could muster, he threw himself back into the fight. Midoriya and Bakugo were in bad shape, but they were fighting. All for One's underlings were trying to force them back through one of those damn portals, and it was all Toshinori could do to keep All for One's attention off of them. He couldn't save them. He couldn't stop the horrific scene from unraveling before him. All he was doing was putting off the inevitable. Even as Gran Torino forced his way into the battle, he knew it was hopeless, but he would be damned if he didn't die on his feet. He knew it was going to take more force than he was using to take down All for One, but he couldn't risk that kind of power with Gran Torino and the children here. He dodged as much as he could, but more often than not, he had to take the hits before they landed on someone else. He was used to the pain. He could take it. His focus was split in 1,000 different directions, and he faltered when he heard another child's voice cry out, "Izuku!" Young Shinso's voice rang out from above them. He looked up to see 6 of his students clinging together and reaching out for their friends. For a moment, his focus was taken up by the image of all of them lying dead on the ground, and it made him sick. All for One took the beat of distraction to land a hit directly over the gnarled scar tissue on his side. He doubled over, and when his vision refocused, he saw All for One reaching out for Midoriya's rapidly receding form. Toshinori leapt after him, heedless of the collateral he may cause. He could hear the ground cracking apart under his feet as he moved. He knew he had caused a shockwave stronger than most people could withstand, but none of that mattered to him as that despicable man made his way toward his students. He heard the sound of a body thudding against the concrete as he grabbed All for One's ankle, and he didn't even turn to see who it was before he used his larger frame to fling the man back into the rubble beneath his feet. He used the second of recoil to reassess the field. The warp villain's body was laying still on the ground, and the rest of All for One's underlings were nowhere to be seen. Midoriya and Bakugo were nothing but a speck in the distance with their classmates, and Gran Torino was slumped against a wall several yards away. He wasn't moving. Toshinori felt something sink in his gut at the sight, but he didn't have time to dwell on it. "Well, All Might, you never cease to impress. I thought harming innocents was against your code of conduct. Of course, we both have legacies to protect. That's something far more important than pesky things like morals, isn't it?" All for One taunted. "He was Shimura's friend, wasn't he?" All for One gestured to where Torino sat motionless before raising his hand to strike again. "You keep her name out of your mouth," Toshinori spat back. He grabbed the wrist All for One had raised hard enough to feel the damn near invulnerable bones in it snap under the pressure. The feeling gave him a sick sort of pleasure. "You will pay for what you did to her," he shouted as he pulled the man forward by the limp appendage. He must have been dazed from the last 2 strikes because he didn't move to block the punch Toshinori aimed at his face. He used his left hand's grip on All for One's wrist to pull him forward and into the full force of his right fist. Part of the mask he wore crumbled under the force, and for the second time in his life, Toshinori felt the man's skull fracture around his knuckles. All for One was beneath him with damaged life support, a shattered wrist, and a fractured skull, but he was still laughing. The damn bastard was still laughing. "What's wrong? You seem to be worked up about something, All Might. Your composure is failing you." He spoke, his tone as steady and patronizing as ever. He could see the blood dripping down his chin and onto the black wool of All for One's suit. "Your master was the same, a foolish woman whose bark was worse than her bite. Do you want me to tell you how I broke her? She hardly put up a fight. She was as frail as you are in the end. I wonder if that boy will be any more formidable, or if he'll be just as pathetic." All for One cooed at him. Toshinori threw another punch before he could stop to realize that there was nothing behind it. All for One caught his fist in the hand that hadn't been broken, and it didn't look like he had even used one of his quirks to do it. He only had a split second to realize that his ragged costume swamped his lithe, powerless body before he was sent flying backward. No, no! This couldn't be it. This couldn't be the end. He couldn't let that man live in the same world as his successor. He could not let Midoriya's life be shadowed in the same fear that his had been. He would not leave this world under the thumb of the man who had ruined his life. "Toshinori!" He heard someone call out to him. That was Torino. Oh, thank Kami, that was Torino. He was dazed and confused, and he was still flying through open air. He had no clue which way was up, which was down, but he figured it out rather quickly when a small mass hit him in the chest and brought him back to Earth. "This isn't over, boy. Get up," the man's gruff voice called out to him. Torino was okay. He had blood in his hair over his right temple, but he was alive. He could feel the last embers of One for All in his chest. They were just as weak and frail as he was. "You know, All Might, as much as you hate me, I think I probably loathe you more. I may have killed your master, but you took away so much from me. Everything I tried to build. I am going to make you suffer until your last breath. You will die broken and disgraced for all the world to see. I will obliterate everything you spent your life protecting," All for One declared as he stepped toward them leisurely. Toshinori saw the man's attention shifted to somewhere just behind the two of them, and his heart sank. There was a civilian crawling out of the rubble, and his body reacted before he gave it the command to move. He tackled the woman back to the ground and shielded her with his withered body as best he could. "Torino, get her out of here!" he shouted, and hoped his voice was heard over the echoes of destruction. Getting back to his shaking feet was a Herculean effort, but he could hear Torino behind him evacuating the civilian. He wasn't going to let this be the end. He wasn't going down unless All for One went down with him. "All the world can see how pitiful you really are now," All for One informed him, gesturing up to the news helicopter in the sky. "The so-called symbol of peace. You don't look so good, All Might." He clenched his jaw and forced himself to let the words roll off his back. "It was never going to last. and I've come to terms with that. You aren't going to trick me with your words this time, all for one. I have far more to fight for than you ever did. He shot back, getting into a fighting stance. The way his body moved felt wrong in this form, but he ignored it. Oh, I miss that indomitable spirit. You're so naive. How trite. You got that from your master, didn't you? Don't worry. I broke her spirit too. A heart of gold is such a persistent pest. All of you had it. Some more than others, but you, worst of all. When does that optimism become delusion? I think both of you went far past that line, didn't you? Toshinori wanted to destroy him for even speaking about Nana, but he stayed put. If All for One wanted to monologue, he would let him. The longer he drew this out, the longer those kids had to get to safety. Nana Shimura was foolish enough to think she could have a family, a husband, and a son. Of course, the only way she could protect them in the end was by keeping them as far away as possible. I think that broke her before I even lifted a finger. She made it too easy. Do you think it was her arrogance or stupidity that drove her to make such an egregious error? Shut up, he gritted out, but of course, All for One didn't listen. I touched a nerve, didn't I? Her child had a family too, a wife and 2 kids. Of course, they're dead now. Everyone besides her grandson. The familial resemblance is there if you look hard enough. Little Tenko grew into something Nana would be so proud of. All for One plowed forward with sarcasm dripping from his tongue. I think Tomura is a much more fitting name for him, though, don't you? The air he'd been forcing through his battered chest stopped in an instant. Tomura Shigaraki? No, it couldn't be. You're lying. The small broken words left his lips before he could stifle them. Oh, come now. You know it's the truth. I would do anything to break your spirit. Taking the boy under my wing was hardly difficult. He was already so lost. When I retrieved him, he was begging for a hero to save him. It's not my fault you weren't listening to his cries, All for One said cheerfully. His clenched fist fell to his side without his say-so. His already pathetic fighting stance started trembling, and All for One laughed louder than ever. Oh, well, that's strange, All Might. Where is your smile now? You bastard. He did his best to say the words forcefully through his gritted teeth, but they came out far too pitiful to be threatening. There it is. That's the last of your strength, isn't it, All Might? A wounded hero is a most frightening animal. Do you know that even now I sometimes dream of you charging at me with your entrails strewn across the ground? All for One noted casually. He felt like he was going to be sick. His body was trembling, and he was tired and mortified, and more afraid than he'd been in a long, long time. He couldn't use One for All like he had been. It was too much for his broken body. So he did what young Midoriya had taught him. He raised one arm and channeled as much power as he could into a single finger and flicked. The motion shattered the bones in his finger, and the shockwave did little more than push the other man off balance. Ah, it's never too late for an old dog to learn new tricks. Or maybe it is. I had hoped you would put up more of a fight. All for One chuckled. All for One returned the lackluster hit with a solid uppercut to Toshinori's middle that had him doubling over and spitting out a concerning amount of blood. This wasn't working, but All for One had a point. A wounded hero was a frightening animal. He had seen what Midoriya had done to protect his teachers and peers at the USJ, and he had heard reports of his battle with Muscular just a few days ago at camp. Midoriya didn't hesitate when it mattered. He used his surroundings and hit where it hurt. Toshinori didn't have much strength left. Just sheer manic desperation. He channeled the last of his strength into his arms. He was off balance and awkward as he raised his right arm to meet the strike All for One had aimed at him. Toshinori had never been one to fake out an opponent. He'd never needed to. His hits were not something one was able to block for long. His vision was starting to fade around the edges. He was an old dog, but he had one more trick. All for One had clasped both his hands together to hammer strike him like an ant. And it was like time slowed down. He was knelt on the ground with no other option than to block the incoming hit. He doubted 100% of his strength would have been enough to save him from that. It was going to hurt, but that was fine. It would be over soon. He braced his right forearm above himself with as much strength as he could spare while he hunched over to hide his left arm from view. There was twisted rebar sticking out of the rubble beneath them. Toshinori grabbed it with his left hand and felt a sudden rush of cold wash over him as he wrenched it free from the concrete. That was it. The last ember had burned out. He could barely see past the spots in his vision, but he didn't let that stop him. With the momentum he had used to rip the rebar free, he thrust it forward into the form of the man towering above him. He heard the sickening squelch of blood and waited for the blow he was bracing for to connect. But it never did. All for One let out a pained sound as his legs crumpled beneath him. In all of his years, it seemed like he had never been able to surprise his nemesis. All for One was always cocksure and 3 steps ahead. He didn't look it now. No amount of cold calculating can predict a cornered animal with everything to lose. With no small amount of effort, Toshinori pulled the rebar out of All for One's gut and rose to shaking feet. The other man was still upright, and he wasn't going down without All for One coming with him. His limbs were shaking from overexertion, and he could barely force a breath through his battered lung. But he gripped the bloody bit of rebar in both hands and swung it at the man's head like a bat. What remained of All for One's helmet shattered and fell to reveal a bloodied, featureless face. Dear Kami, was that all that was left of the man after the fight 5 years ago? The man's face was a mess of gnarled scar tissue. He had no eyes or nose, just a jagged slit across his face where his mouth was. He could hear someone wheezing for air, and he wasn't sure if it was him or All for One. He was dizzy and nauseous, and he couldn't feel his hands anymore. He distantly thought that probably wasn't good. The sound of metal clattering against the ground echoed across the clearing. Oh, he'd dropped the rebar. He hadn't meant to do that. He should probably hold on to that, shouldn't he? The rhythmic thump, 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 thump of helicopter blades pulled his attention back upward. Oh yeah, the camera, the news crew. He won, right? He should. He raised his trembling fist into the air and did his best to force his expression into a smile as he looked up, though he's sure it looked more like a grimace. Everything hurt. His arms, his leg, his chest. God, it hurt. Was it over? The stars were going out above him. It was probably over. He could rest now, couldn't he? Izuku felt like he was going to lose his mind. The stupid freaking wheelchair they'd shoved him in was cold and uncomfortable, and Eraser was pushing him around like he would break into pieces if they took a turn too fast. It was taking everything he had to remain seated and not go running down the hall. Not that he had any idea where he was supposed to be going. Doors and halls were passing by in a blur, and he honestly didn't know the way back to where they'd come from. He had an equal chance of ending up back at his room as he did in finding All Might if he tried looking on his own. So he did his best to calm down and take a deep breath. It felt like an eternity before they finally stopped at a room far from any others. There were several people stationed outside of it, and they were talking to Eraser. But whatever they said was static to his ears. They kept looking at Izuku, but he couldn't understand them well enough to respond if they were even talking to him to begin with. He was about to say, screw it all, stand up and shoulder past them when they finally let him through. The room beyond was nondescript and unremarkable aside from the figure lying in the center of the bed. All Might looked more frail than Izuku had ever seen him. His right arm was against his chest in a cast. There were still flecks of dry blood in his hair. His lips were chapped and slack against the tube stuffed down his throat, but the machines at his bedside beeped rhythmically. The beeps meant he was alive, even if he didn't look it. Izuku focused on the near imperceptible rise and fall of his chest. He was alive, even if it was only barely. He was still alive. Izuku grabbed the handrim on his chair and pushed himself forward, though given how easily he moved, he figured he'd done very little in the way of actually propelling himself. Eraser was still behind him, pushing along. All Might didn't look any better up close. His skin was too pale, a far cry from the healthy tan he normally had. Izuku's hand shook as he hesitantly reached for All Might's wrist. His fingers settled against his pulse point, and he recoiled at how cold his skin was. He's alive. That beeping means he's alive. Izuku returned his fingers to All Might's wrist and breathed with the gentle fluttering of his pulse. He'd seen dead people before. He's felt a wrist without a pulse. Just because he's cold doesn't mean he's dead. Beep, beep, beep. He's alive. Beep, beep, beep. He's alive. He watched the displays at the bedside move with life and felt the blood vessels beneath his fingers flex against delicate wrist bones. None of this was important. Sitting here watching the heart rate monitor wasn't going to heal All Might any faster, and Izuku still had work to do. He needed to be back in Mustafu in 10 days, and he needed to convince Mike and Eraser that he was well enough not to be constantly monitored by then. Who knows if Dabi was going to hold up his side of the deal, but if Izuku's failure to show up cost them his cooperation, then God only knows how many people's blood would be on his hands. He needed to pull himself together. All Might is alive, and even if he wasn't, Izuku couldn't let himself fall apart like that when he had a mission to fulfill. But God, he was so tired. End of chapter.